Heidegger, The Age of the World Picture. In metaphysics, reflection is accomplished concerning the essence of what is, and a decision takes place regarding the essence of truth. Metaphysics grounds an age, in that through a specific interpretation of what is, and through a specific comprehension of truth, it gives to that age the basis upon which it is essentially formed. This basis holds complete dominion over all the phenomena that distinguish the age. Conversely, in order that there may be an adequate reflection upon these phenomena themselves, the metaphysical basis for them must let itself be apprehended in them. Reflection is the courage to make the truth of our own presuppositions and the realm of our own goals into the things that most deserve to be called in question. One of the essential phenomena of the modern age is its science. A phenomenon of no less importance is machine technology. We must not, however, misinterpret that technology as the mere application of modern mathematical physical science to praxis. Machine technology is itself an autonomous transformation of praxis, a type of transformation wherein praxis first demands the employment of mathematical physical science. Machine technology remains up to now the most visible outgrowth of the essence of modern technology, which is identical with the essence of modern metaphysics. A third equally essential phenomenon of the modern period lies in the event of arts moving into the purview of aesthetics. This means that the artwork becomes the object of mere subjective experience, and that consequently art is considered to be an expression of human life. A fourth modern phenomenon manifests itself in the fact that human activity is conceived and consummated as culture. Thus, culture is the realization of the highest values through the nurture and cultivation of the highest goods of man. It lies in the essence of culture as such nurturing, to nurture itself in its turn, and thus to become the politics of culture. A fifth phenomenon of the modern age is the loss of the gods. This expression does not mean the mere doing away with the gods, or gross atheism. The loss of the gods is a twofold process. On one hand, the world picture is Christianized inasmuch as the cause of the world is posited as infinite, unconditional, and absolute. On the other hand, Christendom transforms Christian doctrine into a worldview, the Christian worldview, and in that way makes itself modern and up to date. The loss of the gods is the situation of indecision regarding God and the gods. Christendom has the greatest share in bringing this about. But the loss of the gods is so far from excluding religiosity that rather only through that loss is the relation to the gods changed into mere religious experience. When this occurs, then the gods have fled. The resultant void is compensated for by means of historiographical and psychological investigation of myth. What understanding of what is, what interpretation of truth lies at the foundation of these phenomena? We shall limit the question to a phenomenon mentioned first, to science, Wissenschaft. In what does the essence of modern science lie? What understanding of what is and of truth provides the basis for that essence? If we succeed in reaching the metaphysical ground that provides the foundation for science as a modern phenomenon, then the entire essence of the modern age will have to let itself be apprehended from out of that ground. When we use the word science today, it means something essentially different from the doctrina and scientia of the Middle Ages, and also from the Greek episteme. Greek science was never exact, precisely because, in keeping with its essence, it could not be exact and did not need to be exact. Hence, it makes no sense whatever to suppose that modern science is more exact than that of antiquity. Neither can we say that the Galilean doctrine of freely falling bodies is true, and that Aristotle's teaching that light bodies strive upward is false. For the Greek understanding of the essence of body and place, and of the relation between the two, rests upon a different interpretation of beings, and hence conditions a correspondingly different kind of seeing and questioning of natural events. No one would presume to maintain that Shakespeare's poetry is more advanced than that of Aeschylus. I think that's how you pronounce it, but I don't know, it could be Aeschylus. It is still more impossible to say that the modern understanding of whatever is more correct than that of the Greeks. So it's impossible to say that the modern understanding of whatever is more correct than that of the Greeks. Therefore, if we want to grasp the essence of modern science, we must first free ourselves from the habit of comparing the new science with the old solely in terms of degree, from the point of view of progress. The essence of what we call today science is research. In what does the essence of research consist? In the fact that knowing, das Erkennen, establishes itself as a procedure within some realm of what is, in nature or history. Procedure does not mean here merely method or methodology, for every procedure already requires an open sphere in which it moves, and it is precisely the opening up of such a sphere that is the fundamental event in research. This is accomplished through the projection within some realm of what is, in nature for example, of a fixed ground plan of natural events. The projection sketches out in advance the manner in which the knowing procedure must bind itself and adhere to the sphere opened up. This binding adherence is the rigour of research. Through the projecting of the ground plan and the prescribing of rigour, procedure makes secure for itself its sphere of objects within the realm of being. A look at the earliest science, which is at the same time the normative one in the modern age, namely mathematical physics, will make clear what we mean. Inasmuch as modern atomic physics still remains physics, what is essential, and the only essential is aimed at here, only the essential is aimed at here, will hold for it also. Modern physics is called mathematical because, in a remarkable way, it makes use of a quite specific mathematics. But it can proceed mathematically in this way only because, in a deeper sense, it is already itself mathematical. Ta mathemata, Greek, means for the Greeks that which man knows in advance of his observation of whatever is, and in his intercourse with things, the corporeality of bodies, the vegetable character of plants, the animality of animals, the humanness of man. Alongside these, belonging also to that which is already known, i.e. to the mathematical, are numbers. If we come upon 3 apples on the table, we recognise that there are 3 of them, but the number 3, threeness, we already know. This means that number is something mathematical. Only because numbers represent, as it were, the most striking of always already knowns, and thus offer the most familiar instance of the mathematical, is mathematical promptly reserved as a name for the numerical. In no way, however, is the essence of the mathematical defined by numberness. Physics is, in general, the knowledge of nature, and in particular the knowledge of material corporeality in its motion, for that corporeality manifests itself immediately and universally in everything natural, even if in a variety of ways. If physics takes shape explicitly, then as something mathematical, this means that in an especially pronounced way, through it and for it, something is stipulated in advance of what is already known. That stipulating has to do with nothing less than the plan or projection of that which must henceforth, for the knowing of nature that is sought after, be nature. The self-contained system of motion of units of mass, related spatio-temporally. Into this ground plan of nature, as supplied in keeping with its prior stipulation, the following definitions, among others, have been incorporated. Motion means change of place. No motion or direction of motion is superior to any other. Every place is equal to every other. No point in time has preference over any other. Every force is defined according to, i.e., is only, its consequences in motion, and that means its magnitude of change to the place in the unity of time. Every event must be seen so as to be fitted into this ground plan of nature. Only within the perspective of this ground plan does an event in nature become visible as such an event. This projected plan of nature finds its guarantee in the fact that physical research, in every one of its questioning steps, is bound in advance to adhere to it. This binding adherence, the rigour of research, has its own character at any given time in keeping with the projected plan. The rigour of mathematical physical science is exactitude. Here, at all events, if they are to enter at all into representation as events of nature, must be defined beforehand as spatio-temporal magnitudes of motion. Such defining is accomplished through measuring, with the help of calculation. But mathematical research into nature is not exact because it calculates with precision, rather it must calculate in this way because its adherence to its object sphere has the character of exactitude. The humanistic sciences, in contrast, indeed all the sciences concerned with life, must necessarily be inexact, just in order to remain rigorous. A living thing can indeed also be grasped as a spatio-temporal magnitude of motion, but then it's no longer apprehended as living. The inexactitude of the historical humanistic sciences is not a deficiency, but is only the fulfilment of a demand essential to this type of research. It is true also that the projecting and securing of the object sphere of the historical sciences is not only of another kind, but is more difficult of execution than is the achieving of rigour in the exact sciences. Science becomes research through the projected plan and through the securing of that plan in the rigour of procedure. Projection and rigour, however, first develop into what they are in methodology. The latter constitutes the second essential characteristic of research. If the sphere that is projected is to become objective, then it is a matter of bringing it to encounter us in the complete diversity of its levels and interweavings. Therefore, procedure must be free to view the changeableness in whatever encounters it. Only within the horizon of the incessant otherness of change does the plenitude of particularity, of facts, show itself. But the facts must become objective, gegenständlich. Hence, procedure must represent, vorstellen, the changeable in its changing. It must bring to a stand and let the motion be a motion, nevertheless. The fixedness of facts, and the constantness of their change as such is rule. The constancy of change in necessity of its course is law. It is only within the purview of rule and law that facts become clear as the facts that they are. Research into facts in the realm of nature is intrinsically the establishing and verifying of rule and law. Methodology, through which a sphere of objects comes into representation, has the character of clarifying on the basis of what is clear, of explanation. Explanation is always twofold. It accounts for an unknown by means of a known, and at the same time it verifies that known by means of that unknown. I'm going to read that again because I don't fully understand it. Explanation is always twofold. It accounts for an unknown by means of a known, and at the same time it verifies that known by means of that unknown. Explanation takes place in investigation. In the physical sciences, investigation takes place by means of experiment, always according to the kind of field of investigation and according to the type of explanation aimed at. But physical science does not first become research through experiment. Rather, on the contrary, experiment becomes possible where, and only where, the knowledge of nature has been transformed into research. Only because modern physics is a physics that is essentially mathematical can it be experimental. Because neither medieval doctrina or Greek episteme is science, in the sense of research. For these it is never a question of experiment. To be sure, it was Aristotle who first understood what empiria, experientia, means. I think that relates to empirical. The observation of things themselves, their qualities and modifications under changing conditions, and consequently the knowledge of the way in which things as a rule behave. But an observation that aims at such knowledge, the experimentum, remains essentially different from the observation that belongs to science as research. From the research experiment, it remains essentially different even when ancient and medieval observation also works with number and measure, and even when that observation makes use of specific apparatus and instruments. For in all this, that which is decisive about the experiment is completely missing. Experiment begins with the laying down of a law as a basis. To set up an experiment means to represent or conceive, vorstellen, the conditions under which a specific series of motions can be made susceptible of being followed in its necessary progression, i.e. of being controlled in advance by calculation. But the establishing of a law is accomplished with reference to the ground plan of the object sphere. That ground plan furnishes a criterion and constrains the anticipatory representing of the conditions. Such representing in and through which the experiment begins is no random imagining. That's why Newton said, hypothesis non fingo. The bases that are laid down are not arbitrarily invented. They are developed out of the ground plan of nature and are sketched into it. Experiment is that methodology which, in its planning and execution, is supported and guided on the basis of the fundamental law laid down, in order to adduce the facts that either verify and confirm the law or deny its confirmation. The more exactly the ground plan of nature is projected, the more exact becomes the possibility of experiment. Hence, the much-cited medieval schoolman, Roger Bacon, can never be the forerunner of the modern experimental research scientists. Rather, he remains merely a successor of Aristotle. For in the meantime, the real locus of truth has been transferred by Christendom to faith, to the infallibility of the written word, and to the doctrine of the Church. The highest knowledge and teaching is theology, as the interpretation of the divine word of revelation, which is set down in Scripture and proclaimed by the Church. Here, to know is not to search out, rather it is to understand rightly the authoritative word and the authorities proclaiming it. Therefore, the discussion of the words and doctrinal opinions of the various authorities take precedence in the acquiring of knowledge in the Middle Ages. The componere scripta e sermones, the argumentum ex verbo, is decisive and at the same time is the reason why the accepted Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy that has been taken over had to be transformed into scholastic dialectic. If now Roger Bacon demands the experimentum, and he does demand it, he doesn't mean the experiment of science as research. Rather, he wants the argumentum ex re instead of the argumentum ex verbo. The careful observing of these things themselves, i.e., Aristotelian empiria, instead of the discussion of doctrines. The modern research experiment, however, is not only an observation more precise in degree and scope, but it is a methodology essentially different in kind, related to the verification of law in the framework and at the service of an exact plan of nature. Source criticism in the historical humanistic sciences corresponds to experiment in physical research. Hence the name source criticism designates the whole gamut of the discovery: examination, verification, evaluation, preservation, and interpretation of sources. Historiographical explanation, which is based on source criticism, does not, it's true, trace facts back to laws and rules, but neither does it confine itself to the mere reporting of facts. In the historical sciences, just as in the natural sciences, the methodology aims at representing what is fixed and stable, and at making history an object. History can become objective only when it is past. What is stable in what is past, that on the basis of which historiographical explanation reckons up the solitary and the diverse in history, is always the has-been once already, the comparable. Through the constant comparing of everything with everything, what is intelligible is found by calculation, and is certified and established as the ground plan of history. The sphere of historiographical research extends only so far as historiographical explanation reaches. The unique, the rare, the simple, in short, the great, in history, is never self-evident, and hence remains inexplicable. It is not that historical research denies what is great in history, rather it explains it as the exception. In this explaining, the great is measured against the ordinary and the average, and there is no other historiographical explanation, so long as explaining means reduction to what is intelligible, and so long as historiography remains research, i.e., an explaining. Because historiography as research projects and objectifies the past, in the sense of an explicable and surveyable nexus of actions and consequences, it requires source criticism as its instrument of objectification. The standards of this criticism alter to the degree that historiography approaches journalism. Every science is, as research, grounded upon the projection of a circumscribed object sphere, and is therefore necessarily a science of individualized character. Every individualized science must, moreover, in the development of its projected plan by means of its methodology, particularize itself into specific fields of investigation. This particularization, specialization, is, however, by no means simply an irksome commitment of the increasing unsurveyability of the results of research. It is not a necessary evil, but is rather an essential necessity of science as research. Specialization is not the consequence, but the foundation of the progress of all research. Research does not, through its methodology, become dispersed into random investigations, so as to lose itself in them, for modern science is determined by a third fundamental event, that of ongoing activity. But this is to be understood first of all the phenomenon that a science today, whether physical or humanistic, attains to the respect due a science only when it has become capable of being institutionalized. However, research is not ongoing activity because its work is accomplished in institutions. However, research is not ongoing activity because its work is accomplished in institutions, but rather institutions are necessary because science, intrinsically as research, has the character of ongoing activity. The methodology through which individual object spheres are conquered does not simply amass results. Rather, with the help of its results, it adapts, which in German is richtet sich ein. It adapts itself for a new procedure. Within the complex of machinery that is necessary to physics in order to carry out the smashing of the atom lies hidden the whole of physics up till now. Correspondingly, in historiographical research, funds of new source material become usable for explanation only if those sources are themselves guaranteed on the basis of historiographical explanation. In the course of these processes, the methodology of the science becomes circumscribed by means of its results. More and more, the methodology adapts itself to the possibilities of procedure opened up through itself. This having to adapt itself to its own results, as the ways and means of an advancing methodology, is the essence of research's character as an ongoing activity. And in that character, that is the intrinsic basis for the necessity of the institutional nature of research. In ongoing activity, the plan of an object sphere is, for the first time, built into whatever is. All adjustments that facilitate a planable conjoining of types of methodology, that further the reciprocal checking and communication of results, and that regulate the exchange of talents, are measures that are by no means only the external consequences of the fact that research work is expanding and proliferating. Rather, research work becomes the distant sign, still far from being understood, that modern science is beginning to enter upon the decisive phase of its history. Now, and only now, is it beginning to take possession of its own complete essence. What is taking place in this extending and consolidating of the institutional character of the sciences? What is taking place? Nothing less than the making secure of the precedence of methodology over whatever is nature and history, which at any given time becomes objective in research. On the foundation of their character as ongoing activity, the sciences are creating for themselves the solidarity and unity appropriate to them. Therefore, historiographical or archaeological research that is carried forward in an institutionalized way is essentially closer to research in physics than is in physics that is similarly organized than it is to a discipline belonging to its own faculty in the humanistic sciences that still remains mired in mere erudition. Hence, the decisive development of the modern character of science as ongoing activity also forms men of a different stamp and women of a different stamp. The scholar disappears. He is succeeded by the research person who is engaged in research projects. These, rather than the cultivating of erudition, lend to the work its atmosphere of incisiveness. The research person no longer needs a library at home. Moreover, he is constantly on the move. He negotiates at meetings and collects information at congresses. He contracts for commissions with publishers. The latter now determine along with him which books must be written. The research worker necessarily presses forward of herself into the sphere characteristic of the technologist in the essential sense. Only in this way is she capable of acting effectively, and only thus, after the manner of her age, is she real. Alongside her, the increasingly thin and empty romanticism of scholarship and the university will still be able to persist for some time in a few places. However, the effective unity characteristic of the university, and hence the latter's reality, does not lie in some intellectual power belonging to an original unification of the sciences and emanating from the university because nourished by and preserved in it. The university is real as an orderly establishment that, in a form still unique because it's administratively self-contained, makes possible and visible the striving apart of the sciences into the particularization and peculiar unity that belong to ongoing activity. Because the forces intrinsic to the essence of modern science come immediately and unequivocally to effective working in ongoing activity, therefore, also, it is only the spontaneous ongoing activities of research that can sketch out and establish the internal unity with other like activities that is commensurate with themselves. The real system of science consists in a solidarity of procedure and attitude with respect to the objectification of whatever is. A solidarity that is brought about appropriately at any given time on the basis of planning. The excellence demanded of this system is not some contrived and rigid unity of the relationship among object spheres, having to do with content, but is rather the greatest possible free, though regulated, flexibility in the shifting about and introducing of research apropos of the leading tasks at any given time. The more exclusively science individualizes itself with a view to the total carrying on and mastering of its work process, and the more realistically these ongoing activities are shifted into separate research institutes and professional schools, the more irresistibly do the sciences achieve the consummation of their modern essence. But the more unconditionally science and the man of research take seriously the modern form of their essence, the more unequivocally and the more immediately they will be able to offer themselves for the common good, and the more unreservedly, too, will they have to return to the public anonymity of all work useful to society. Modern science simultaneously establishes itself and differentiates itself in its projections of specific object spheres. These projection plans are developed by means of a corresponding methodology, which is made secure through rigour. Methodology adapts and establishes itself at any given time in ongoing activity. Projection and rigour, methodology and ongoing activity, mutually requiring one another, constitute the essence of modern science, and they transform science into research. We are reflecting on the essence of modern science in order that we may apprehend it in its metaphysical ground. What understanding of what is, and what concept of truth provide the basis for the fact that science is being transformed into research? We are reflecting on the... I've just read that. Knowing as research calls whatever is to account with regard to the way in which, and the extent to which, it lets itself be put at the disposal of representation. Research has disposal over anything that is when it can either calculate in its future. Research has disposal over anything that is, when it can either calculate it in its future course in advance or verify a calculation about it as past. Nature in being calculated in advance and history in being historiographically verified as past become, as it were, set in place or gestalt. Nature and history become the objects of a representing that explains. Such representing counts on nature and takes account of history. Only that which becomes object in this way is considered to be in being We first arrive at science as research when the being of whatever is sought in such objectiveness. This objectifying of whatever is accomplished in a setting before, a representing, that aims at bringing each particular being before it in such a way that man who calculates can be sure, and that means be certain, of that being. We first arrive at science as research when, and only when, truth has been transformed into the certainty of representation. What it is to be is for the first time defined as the objectiveness of representing, and truth is first defined as the certainty of representing in the metaphysics of Descartes. The title of Descartes' principal work reads Meditazione de prima philosophia, Meditations on First Philosophy. Proto-philosophia is the designation coined by Aristotle for what is later called metaphysics. The whole of modern metaphysics taken together, Nietzsche included, maintains itself within the interpretation of what it is to be and of truth that was prepared by Descartes. Now, if science as research is an essential phenomenon of the modern age, it must be that which constitutes the metaphysical ground of research determines first and long beforehand the essence of that age generally. The essence of the modern age can be seen in the fact that man frees himself from the bonds of the Middle Ages in freeing himself to himself. But this correct characterization contains and remains nevertheless superficial. It leads to those errors that prevent us from comprehending the essential foundation of the modern age, and, from there, judging the scope of the age's essence. Certainly the modern age has, as a consequence of the liberation of man, introduced subjectivism and individualism, but it remains just as certain that no age before this one has produced a comparable objectivism, and that in no age before this has the non-individual, in the form of the collective, come to acceptance as having worth. Essential here is the necessary interplay between subjectivism and objectivism. It is precisely this reciprocal conditioning of one by the other that points back to events more profound. What is decisive is not that man frees himself to himself from previous obligations, but that the very essence of man itself changes, in that man becomes subject. We must understand this word subjectum, however, as the translation of the Greek hypokaimenon. The word names that which lies before, which, as ground, gathers everything onto itself. This metaphysical meaning of the concept of subject has first of all no special relationship to man and none at all to the I, as in the person I, not I on your face. However, when a man becomes the primary and only real subjectum, that means man, that being upon which all that is grounded as regards the manner of its being and its truth. Man becomes the relational centre of that which is as such. But this is only possible when the comprehension of what is as a whole changes. In what does this change manifest itself? What, in keeping with it, is the essence of the modern age? When we reflect on the modern age, we are questioning concerning the modern world picture, the Weitbild. We characterise the latter by throwing it into relief over against the medieval and ancient world pictures. But why, do we ask, concerning a world picture in our interpreting of a historical age? Does every period of history have its world picture, and indeed in such a way as to concern itself from time to time about the world picture? Or Is this, after all, only a modern kind of representing? This asking concerning a world picture. What is a world picture? Obviously, it's a picture of the world, but what does world mean here, and what does picture mean? World serves here as a name for what is in its entirety. The name is not limited to the cosmos or to nature. History also belongs to the world. Yet even nature and history, and both interpenetrating in their underlying and transcending of one another, do not exhaust the world. In this designation, the ground of the world is meant also, no matter how its relation to the world is thought. With the word picture, we think first of all of a copy of something. Accordingly, the world picture would be a painting, so to speak, of what it is as a whole. But world picture means more than this. We mean by it the world itself, the world as such, what is, in its entirety, just as it is normative and binding for us. Picture here does not mean some imitation, but rather what sounds forth in the colloquial expression, we get the picture. Literally, we are in the picture concerning something. This means the matter stands before us exactly as it stands with it for us. To get the picture, literally to put oneself in the picture, with respect to something, means to set whatever is itself in place before oneself, just in the way that it stands with it, and to have it fixedly before oneself as set up in this way. But a decisive determinant in the essence of the picture is still missing. We get the picture concerning something does not mean only that what is set before us, is represented to us in general, but that what is stands before us in all that belongs to it and all that stands together in it as a system. To get the picture throbs with being acquainted with something, with being equipped and prepared for it. Where the world becomes picture, what is, in its entirety, is juxtaposed as that for which man is prepared, and which correspondingly he therefore intends to bring before himself and have before himself, and consequently intends in a decisive sense to set in place before himself. Hence, the world picture, when understood essentially, does not mean a picture of the world, but the world conceived and grasped as picture. What is, in its entirety, is now taken in such a way that it first is in being, and only is in being to the extent that it is set up by people who represent and set forth. Wherever we have the world picture, an essential decision takes place regarding what is in its entirety. The being of whatever is sought and found in the representedness of the latter. However, everywhere that whatever is not interpreted in this way, the world also cannot enter into a picture. There can be no world picture. The fact that whatever is comes into being in and through representedness transforms the age in which this occurs into a new age in contrast with the preceding one. The expressions world picture of the modern age and modern world picture both mean the same thing, and both assume something that never could have been before, namely, a medieval and an ancient world picture. The world picture doesn't change from an earlier medieval one into a modern one, but rather the fact that the world becomes a picture at all is what distinguishes the essence of the modern age, or der Neuzeit. From the Middle Ages, in contrast, that which is the ens creatum, that which is created by the personal creator God as the highest cause. Here, to be in being means to belong within a specific rank of the order of what has been created, a rank appointed from the beginning, and as thus caused to correspond to the cause of creation, analogia entis. But never does the being of that which is consist here in the fact that it is brought before man as the objective. I'm going to have to try that sentence again. But never does the being of that which is consist here in the fact that it is brought before man as the objective, in the fact that it is placed in the realm of man's knowing and of his having disposal, and that it is in being only in this way. The modern interpretation of that which is even further away from the interpretation characteristic of the Greeks. One of the oldest pronouncements of Greek thinking regarding the being of that which is runs to ga auto naian estin tekai anai. This sentence of Parmenides means, the apprehending of whatever is belongs to being because it is demanded and determined by being. That which is that which arises and opens itself, which, as what presence is, comes upon man as the one who presence is, i.e., comes upon the one who himself opens himself to what presence is in that he apprehends it. That which is does not come into being at all through the fact that man first looks upon it in the sense of a representing that has the character of subjective perception. Rather, man is the one who is looked upon by that which is. He is the one who is, in company with itself, gathered towards presencing by that which opens itself. To be beheld by what is, to be included and maintained within its openness, and in that way to be borne along by it, to be driven about by its oppositions and marked by its discord. That is the essence of man in the great age of the Greeks. Therefore, in order to fulfill his essence, Greek man must gather, legein, and save, surzein, catch up and preserve, what opens itself in its openness, and he must remain exposed, alethein, to all its sundering confusions. Greek man is as the one who apprehends, de venema, that which is, and that is why in the age of the Greeks the world cannot become a picture. Yet on the other hand, that the beingness of whatever is defined for Plato as eidos, or aspect and view, is the presupposition destined far in advance and long ruling indirectly in concealment for the world's having to become a picture. In distinction from Greek apprehending, modern representing, whose meaning the word representatio first brings to its earliest expression, intends something quite different. Here, to represent, vorstellen, means to bring what is present at hand, das Vorhandene, before oneself as something standing over against, to relate it to oneself, to the one representing it, and to force it back into this relationship to oneself as the normative realm. Whenever this happens, man gets into the picture in precedence over whatever is. But in that, man puts himself into the picture in this way. He puts himself into the scene, i.e., into the open sphere of that which is generally and publicly represented. Therewith, man sets himself up as the setting in which whatever is must henceforth set itself forth, must present itself, sich presentieren, even, i.e. be picture. Man becomes the representative, the Repräsentant, of that which is, in the sense of that which has the character of object. But the newness in this event by no means consists in the fact that now the position of man in the midst of what is an entirely different one, in contrast to that of medieval and ancient man. What is decisive is that man himself expressly takes up this position as one constituted by himself, and that he intentionally maintains it as that taken up by himself, and that he makes it secure as a solid footing for a possible development of humanity. Now, for the first time, is there any such thing as a position of man? Man makes depend upon himself the way in which he must take his stand in relation to whatever is as the objective. There begins that way of being human which mans the realm of human capability as a domain given over to measuring and executing for the purpose of gaining mastery over that which is as a whole. The age that is determined from out of this event is, when viewed in retrospect, not only a new one in contrast with the one that is past, but it settles itself firmly into place expressly as the new. To be new is peculiar to the world that has become picture. When, accordingly, the picture character of the world is made clear as the representedness of what is, then in order to fully grasp the modern essence of representedness, we must track out and expose the original naming power of the worn-out word and concept to represent, vorstellen, to set out before oneself and to set forth in relation to oneself. Through this, whatever is comes to a stand as object, and in that way alone receives the seal of being. That the world becomes picture is one and the same event with the event of man's becoming subjectum in the midst of that which is. Only because and insofar as man actually and essentially has become subject, it is necessary for him as a consequence to confront the explicit question, is it an I confined to its own preferences and freed into its own arbitrary choosing, or as the we of society? Is it an individual or as a community? Is it as a personality within the community or as a mere group member in the corporate body? Is it as a state and nation and as a people, or as the common humanity of modern man, that man will and ought to be the subject that is in his modern essence? He already is. Only where man is essentially already subject does there exist the possibility of his slipping into the aberration of subjectivism in the sense of individualism. But also, only where man remains subject does the positive struggle against individualism and for the community as the sphere of these goals that govern all achievement and usefulness have any meaning. The interweaving of these two events, which for the modern age is decisive, that the world is transformed into picture and man into subjectum, throws light at the same time on the grounding event of modern history, an event that at first glance seems almost absurd, namely the more extensively and the more effectually the world stands at man's disposal as conquered, and the more objectively the object appears, all the more subjectively, i.e. the more importunately does the subjectum rise up, and all the more impetuously too do observations of and teaching about the world change into doctrine of man, into anthropology. It is no wonder that humanism first arises when the world becomes a picture. It would have been just as impossible for a humanism to have gained currency in the age of the Greeks as it would have been impossible to have had anything like a world picture in that age. Humanism, therefore, in the more strict historiographical sense, is nothing but a moral aesthetic anthropology. The name anthropology, as used here, does not mean just some investigation of man by a natural science, nor does it mean the doctrine established within Christian theology of man, created, fallen, and redeemed. It designates that philosophical interpretation of man which explains and evaluates whatever is, in its entirety, from the standpoint of man and in relation to man. The increasingly exclusive rooting of the interpretation of the world in anthropology, which has set in since the end of the 18th century, finds its expression in the fact that the fundamental stance of man in relation to what is, in its entirety, is defined as a world view, or a Weltanschauung, I can't pronounce that. Since this time, this word has been admitted into common usage. As soon as the world becomes picture, the position of man is conceived as a world view. To be sure, the phrase worldview is open to misunderstanding, as though it were merely a matter here of a passive contemplation of the world. For this reason, already in the 19th century it was emphasised with justification that worldview also meant, and even meant primarily, a view of life. The fact that, despite this, the phrase worldview asserts itself as the name for the position of man in the midst of all that is proof of how decisively the world became picture as soon as man brought his life as subjectum into precedence over other centres of relationship. This means whatever is considered to be in being only to the degree and to the extent that it is taken into and referred back to this life, i.e. is lived out and becomes life experience. Just as unsuited to the Greek spirit as every humanism had to be, just so impossible was a medieval worldview, and just as absurd is a Catholic worldview. Just as necessarily and legitimately as everything must change into life experience for modern man, the more unlimitedly he takes charge of the shaping of his essence. Just so certainly could the Greeks at the Olympian festivals never have had life experiences. The only fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as picture. The world picture, Bild in German, now means the structured image, Gebild, that is the creature of man's producing, which represents and sets before. In such producing, man contends for the position in which he can be that particular being who gives the measure and draws the guidelines for everything that is. Because this position secures, organises, articulates itself as a world view. The modern relationship to that which is one that becomes, in its decisive unfolding, a confrontation of world views, and indeed not of random world views, but only of those that have already taken up the fundamental position of man that is most extreme, and have done so with the utmost resoluteness. For the sake of this struggle of world views, and in keeping with its meaning, man brings into play his unlimited power for the calculating, planning, and moulding of all things. Science as research is an absolutely necessary form of all this establishing of self in the world. It is one of the pathways upon which the modern age ranges towards fulfilment of its essence, with a velocity unknown to the participants. With this struggle of world views, the modern age first entered into the part of its history, and that is the most decisive and probably the most capable of enduring. A sign of this event is that everywhere, and in the most varied forms and disguises, the gigantic is making its appearance. In so doing, it evidences itself simultaneously in the tendency towards the increasingly small. We have only to think of numbers in atomic physics. The gigantic presses forward in a form that actually seems to make it disappear in the annihilation of great distances by the aeroplane, in the setting before us of foreign and remote worlds in their everydayness, which is produced at random through flick of a hand in the radio. Yet we think too superficially if we suppose that the gigantic is only the endlessly extended emptiness of the purely quantitative. We think too little if we find that the gigantic, in the form of a continual not ever having been here yet, originates only in a blind mania for exaggerating and excelling. We do not think at all if we believe we have explained this phenomenon of the gigantic with the catchword Americanism. The gigantic is rather that through which the quantitative becomes a special quality and thus a remarkable kind of greatness. Each historical age is not only great in a distinctive way in contrast to others, it also has, in each instance, its own concept of greatness. But as soon as the gigantic, in planning and calculating and adjusting and making secure shifts over out of the quantitative and becomes a special quality, then what is the gigantic and what can seemingly always be calculated completely becomes precisely through this incalculable. This becoming incalculable remains the invisible shadow that is cast around all things everywhere when man has been transformed into subjectum and the world into picture. By means of this shadow, the modern world extends itself out into a space withdrawn from representation, and so lends to the incalculable the determinateness peculiar to it, as well as a historical uniqueness. This shadow, however, points to something else which is denied to us today to know. But man will never be able to experience and ponder this that is denied, so long as he dawdles about in the mere negating of the age. The flight into tradition, out of a combination of humility and presumption, can bring about nothing in itself other than self-deception and blindness in relation to the historical moment. Man will know, i.e., carefully safeguard into its truth, that which is incalculable only in creative questioning and shaping out of the power of genuine reflection. Reflection transports the man of the future into that between in which he belongs to being and yet remains a stranger amid that which is. Hölderlin knew of this. His poem, which bears the superscription "To the Germans," closes, "How narrowly bounded is our lifetime, we see and count the number of our years. But have the years of nations been seen by mortal eye? If your soul throbs in longing over its own time mourning, then you linger on the cold shore among your own and never know them." And that's the end. Appendixes, or appendices. Number 1. Such reflection is not necessary for all, nor is it to be accomplished or even found bearable by everyone. On the other hand, absence of reflection belongs to a very great extent to certain definite stages of achieving and moving forward, and yet the questioning belonging to reflection never becomes either groundless or beyond all question, because in anticipation it questions concerning being. Being is for it that which is most worthy of questioning. Reflection finds in being its most extreme resistance, which constrains it to deal seriously with whatever is as the latter is brought into the light of its being. Reflection on the essence of the modern age puts thinking and decision into the sphere of effective working that belongs to the genuinely essential forces of this age. These forces work as they will, beyond the reach of all everyday valuation. In the face of these forces there is only a readiness for their decisive issue, or instead an evasive turning away into the ahistorical. I lost my place. In this connection, however, it is not sufficient to affirm technology, for example, or out of an attitude incomparably more, to set up total mobilization and as an absolute once it is recognized as being at hand. It is a matter of constantly grasping in advance the essence of the age from out of the truth of being, holding away within it. For only thus, simultaneously, is that which is most worthy of questioning experienced, i.e., that which radically carries forward and constrains a creating into the future, out beyond what is at hand, and lets the transformation of man become a necessity springing forth from being itself. No age lets itself be done away with by negating decree. Negation only throws the negator off the path. The modern age requires, however, in order to be withstood in the future, in its essence, and on the very strength of its essence, an originality and range of reflection for which we of today are perhaps preparing somewhat, but over which we certainly can never gain mastery. And that is the end of appendix number 1.